Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Inside Out from 2015. Now, I think a lot of people have probably seen this one, and I didn't even necessarily intend to watch it. This is one that I haven't watched for a variety of reasons. So let me step back for a second. I've talked before on this show and in my videos in general about my feelings on kids' movies and Pixar in particular, and especially what it means to make something that is a movie for kids versus a kids' movie. This is in the era of Pixar that I tend not to care too much for. As I've talked about before, Pixar was sort of done to me when, well, it goes up and down. Toy Story 3 is sort of the last one they made that I was really like, yeah, this was really solid. And there were a few that were on the downward trend before that. In particular, Cars is a notable fixture of like, this is less like Pixar and more like Disney. And that's not to slander Disney or, well, yeah, definitely not to slander Disney because I don't want to get sued. But like the introduction of Disney's influence into Pixar's development, in my opinion, seems to have substantially hampered the kind of things that are produced and made them lean more towards its improved Disney movies and decrease the quality of Pixar movies. And now, they're just one big company, so it's neither here nor there, but, I grew up during the era when they weren't. Inside Out, I was a later film, it was 2015, so it's sort of in that era of like, I've already seen like half the movies that came out during this era, and a lot of them I'm kind of on, like they're fine, but not fantastic. And in addition to all that, part of the reason I didn't get around to watching this one is because it definitely gives off the impression that it's gonna be really tugging hard at your heartstrings. And to some extent it does, and to some extent it doesn't. And it's almost a bigger problem. I almost said it's almost worse, but I'm going to say it's almost a bigger problem that it is inconsistent in how it does that. I skimmed over the Wikipedia article for this movie afterwards, and it is a bizarre read because it has not been edited very well. Whoever has been looking after that page has not been doing a great job. It's a big wall of text, and a lot of it is really poorly formatted and seems like it's been either hacked to pieces. Never mind. The point here that I'm trying to get at is that this had kind of a long development cycle and ran into a bunch of production issues where people couldn't agree on how things should go, and substantial parts of the story were reworked over and over again. And having that context, it makes sense because this movie to me sort of feels like that. I was hoping this one would surprise me and be really good. And there are some things in this film that I think are really strong. Unfortunately, the things that I think are really strong are kind of few and far between. They are mostly individual scenes that I happen to think work really well, but don't tie in super well to the rest of the movie. And overall, I was really hopeful. I was really hopeful that this would be a bit like Turning Red. Obviously, this preceded Turning Red. Is that what it was called? Hold on. Why does that feel wrong? No, that was the name of it. Okay, I did do that. Sorry for the holdup. So I really enjoyed Turning Red, and I thought it was a really powerful film with a lot of really good production and a lot of like Pixar-esque, classic Pixar-esque kind of content and insight and that sort of thing. And I was hoping that this would be, if not a return to form, at least a little bit different from most of the Pixar films that come out in the 2010s that I was sort of meh on. Unfortunately, this movie can't seem to focus on what it wants to do. The number one problem that I see with it is that it spends too much time with the imagined characters inside the main character Riley, her head. All these cartoony characters are the manifestations of her, like, adolescent psychology. And it spends too much time with those characters having shenanigans and just having things happen in this imaginary world inside her head. Although you could talk about like how imaginary is it versus like metaphorical realism. And so the movie becomes focused on these manifestations of emotion, and it focuses on them as characters rather than what they mean to Riley. So you've got Joy is the main character, big air quotes, the manifestation of her sort of happiness and all these other positive emotions, and sort of the leader of the group. And the movie ends up being about Joy instead of Riley. And I think that is a huge, huge misstep, because it's about Joy doesn't have the growth that would be necessary to then transfer to Riley. It's not impossible to write a version of the script where the growth that Joy sees, where she like lets go of some of her attachments and like doesn't get in the way of everybody else, all of the other emotions as much, and sort of sees what everybody can bring to the table. And that can then transfer into or run parallel to character growth that Riley is having, where she's struggling with these real world events, and is having to like deal with the emotions and the psychology that comes out of that. But instead, most of the movie is focused on this weird journey happening in Riley's head that doesn't mesh really very much with the story that's going outside in the real world. And the real world is more used just as an excuse to influence events inside. It's sort of a Deus Ex Machina operation on it's a reason for the inside things to happen. Not the inside things aren't causing the outside things to happen. And I feel like that's a huge misstep. The outside story is actually very interesting, and I think it would be really powerful to the right group of people if it was rewritten and more fleshed out and more run in parallel with the inside story. Riley is in a situation where she's got her mom and dad who are moving to a very different place from where she lived before. She's not happy at moving. She's not happy about losing her friends. She's not happy at the new place she's in. She's not happy with the behaviors that her parents are showing. Like, it's a time of a lot of upheaval and unhappiness, and it's an opportunity for a lot of growth, because that upending, especially for a preteen kid, it can be very traumatic. And the way that could then influence the metaphorical world inside her head and lessen the powers of certain emotions and increase the powers of others, could be a really interesting dynamic in the character of Joy realizing that she has to start taking a back seat, and that even though a lot of the other emotions tend to be looked at as negative, they have their place and they are important and valuable. And they almost do that, but then you just have this weird story of joy and sadness going on this little escapade, this little trip where the other three emotions are basically absent. They're just, they are just there in the control room to cause other shenanigans in the real world that don't really tie in. And the joy and sadness don't really get a lot of growth by the end. There's a little bit of like understanding of that they are both like they have a better balance between the two of them. And there are moments of what I can only describe as like the kids movie growth, where there wasn't a lot of agency and there wasn't a lot of direct influence for the characters to it's events happening because they are good on screen for kids, because they are entertaining, and because they are frankly a little bit cheap in terms of getting certain emotions to come out, either laughter or sadness or whatever else, which are things that are typically what movies aimed at a younger audience target a little more strongly to make themselves compelling and keep interest. So instead we get this mess where it's telling some meaningful stories and almost delves into some really important topics, similar to Turning Red, where it's like, oh, these are the problem behaviors in the parents, and this is how like the parents have their own emotions and they're governed by those emotions, and like different emotions are in charge of each of the parents. Like it looks to me visually like the reading is that like anger is in charge of the dad and sadness is in charge of the mom, but they're also both kind of reasonably well balanced people. Like the manifestations of their emotions in their heads are a lot more sort of in tune with each other, and even though they are driven by those things, they are not inherently like problematic characters. But that gets even more into the, well, why didn't we see more of other characters having the same struggles? Riley becomes a character who has very little agency in her own, like from both directions, has very little agency in her own arc, because her internal emotions are like sort of breaking down on their own, and the external events are contrived in order to push the internal narrative and vice versa. And so you have this like circular relationship between the two, where they're just sort of spinning wheels and in order to get to their next scene rather than driving a specific narrative arc. So by the end, like the redeeming factor is basically a single scene towards the end of the film where like there's finally an emotional opening and an acknowledgement of in the outer world of the issues going on, but it takes so long to get there that it feels unsatisfying. It is not fleshed out enough. The reasons for it happening are not strong enough. Riley's not really a character. She's she's just a story element, which is kind of a problem, especially in a kid's film, as I've talked about, or a film for kids, whichever term you want to use. As I've talked about before, the idea of making films for children means you have to target, you have to simplify things and you have to target certain things more strongly. So strong character growth is a really important aspect of making a film for kids. If you don't have compelling characters that are relatable and simple enough to read in their progress, growth, and motivations, that to me is a big issue for calling it a strong kids film. And I'm going to keep drawing these comparisons because it's hard not to. to Turning Red, because I think that's so much a stronger movie than this one, and says a lot more, is a lot more focused, and is a lot more honest. Possibly the thing that bothered me the most is some of the obfuscations or the metaphors used for the goings on inside Riley's head. She's under these circumstances where a lot of her feelings are valid but not healthy, right? And especially as an adolescent, it's a period when having new emotions that you don't understand can push you very quickly towards making bad decisions or not knowing what to do with yourself or feeling overwhelmed. And that is a topic that persists throughout adulthood. Obviously, it feels very strong when you're a kid, but is something that I feel like lots of people could do better at reckoning with in their own lives, adults or otherwise. So the story not leading to a clear path or a clear there's so many different ways you could go with this. You could have the parents be more compassionate and helpful and try and work her through it. You could have Riley have more of her own arc where she realizes that she's being self-destructive. You could have the internal narrative where the emotions get together and confer and realize they need to do things differently because the status quo is no longer working. And none of those things really happen. And then there's the actual metaphors for the bad things that are happening inside. And the one that sticks out to me the most as both interesting but also kind of deeply wrong is this idea that joy, they have these core memories, and I think this is where that core memory meme comes from originally, is like she's got these couple of memories that are like really strong and they're all joy memories, and joy is driven to like protect these memories, and sadness like just touches memories and ruins them. And they don't ever really address that problem. They sort of indirectly by the end sort of say it's okay for good memories to go away, but they never address the fact that sadness is sometimes a positive thing, and sometimes you need anger, sometimes you need fear, sometimes you need what's the fifth one, disgust, I think. It's hard to say because the fear and disgust characters are almost non-existent in the film. They almost don't need to be there, but that's neither here nor there. Where the emotions are strong, but they don't say anything by the end to say this is the process of becoming an adult or maturing, is to realize that your emotions are strong and they are necessary and they can be really helpful, even the ones that we typically think of as negative. And you can't be joyful all the time. And sometimes the memories that you have held on to for so long, they become, you can't attach yourself to them too hard, because if something happens to them or if you make associations with them that are too negative, you can either get into a state of like arrested development, or you just if they fall through, you'd like fall into sort of despair or whatever. If these things that you thought were good suddenly become bad and you've attached yourself so hard to them, there's so many things that could be said there, and instead it kind of just doesn't say a lot. By the end, Riley finds herself again, but it's a return to the status quo, rather more or less a return to the status quo rather than a real element of growth. And it's a positive ending generally, but I feel like it's disingenuous especially to kids who might see parallels in their own lives, or adults who might see parallels in their own lives, who might want to consider what the ramifications of their emotions are, and that they can't let their emotions control them, but they can't there has to be this balancing act that constantly goes on, and that people need help sometimes, especially that they need help from outside themselves. And maybe that's the most disappointing thing to me, is just that the idea of fixing it. I almost wish that the narrative was that the inside emotions failed and they could not fix themselves. And the only way that Riley was able to come back to an element of normalcy was to have growth from outside, where you have other people who have different emotions and different states and different capacities, and are able to go to her and say, hey, it's totally okay for you to be angry or sad or miss people or lose friends or whatever, but don't let yourself drown in that. And here, let's come do this thing. Let's make a new joyful memory. And they just don't kind of don't do that. It's really disappointing. And that's not to say this is a bad film either, because production-wise, I think there's a lot in this that's really good. Visually, it's a Pixar movie. It's kind of stunning. It's visually detailed in a way that so many, in a unique way, just like so many other Pixar movies present like a new visual styling. And it deserves props for that. I think it's got some great music, and sound design in general is really solid. And it's even got some like powerfully written scenes that I think are really good. They're kind of few and far between, unfortunately, but like there's some good stuff in there. And maybe I'm just misreading this, and this is targeted at a younger audience than I think it should be. Maybe that's the issue. But that always comes back to my thing about movies for kids, which is that there is no excuse for making a movie for children that can't also be enjoyed by people who are older. You don't have to treat children, big air quotes, like children. Children are, for all my dislike of them, reasonably emotionally capable and mature, and I think often have a better grasp of the world around them, even if they don't see it in the same way as the adults, have a better grasp of the world around them than they are given credit for. And I think the idea of not allowing children to be emotionally mature, not giving them like mature narratives to and mature stories to understand the world through is a disservice to children and to the world at large. So I don't know. Like, I was really hopeful that especially a movie about emotions made by Pixar, a studio that typically does emotions pretty well, would have a little bit stronger showing here. And it's not bad, but it's not great either. It's in the lower end, but definitely not near the bottom of Pixar's listings. I'm glad I finally watched it, because it is decent, but I just wanted more. Anyway, I could talk more about the production for a while, but I think that's about it. The voice acting quality, pretty star-studded cast actually, but yeah, pretty good. Anyway, I think that's all the thoughts I'm going to leave with. I just wanted it to be a little better. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.